The relationship between housing, education, and employment creates a sort of vicious cycle. Using the American Community Survey, it was determined in 2013 that only 60% of Black students are enrolled in K-12 schools, and only 31% are high school graduates. These statistics correlate with the same survey declaring that only 62% are in the labor force, while 58% of those surveys rent their homes, and another 23% live below the poverty line. These numbers alluded to a larger trend that links employment, housing, and education, and that trend began in post-World War II 1940s.
Housing segregation after World War II is looked at as a cause of the second ghettos. Apartments that were occupied by whites would soon be taken over and overpopulated by people of color. People began to flee to the north from places like Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, to go live in places like St. Louis, New York, Chicago, causing a rapid growth in population. Even though these people were leaving from the South in very difficult situations, they couldn't stay in many places that they were wanting to stay in. They were not allowed to live in certain areas due to housing policies, redlining, and zoning. Blacks were limited options as to where they could stay and where they would also be welcomed at. Oftentimes, even if you were a well-paid black man, like a doctor, a lawyer, you would still have to stay in the ghettos or the slums that blacks were placed in. Whites began to leave the city and live in the suburbs due to the overpopulation of blacks moving into the inner cities.
We've got to move.
And so they joined the stream of family life in the suburbs.
But still, as blacks were trying to leave out of the inner cities and live in these suburbs with the white people, it was oftentimes denied. The Federal Housing Administration, for example, routinely denied access to blacks to live in these suburbs where whites were going to live at. Property owners, as well, would deny blacks access to live in these neighborhoods because they were scared that if they would welcome them in, then that would make the white people leave, causing values of property houses to go down. Landowners will also raise their rent or down payments triple times just for black people trying to move into their neighborhoods. And these housing projects that the blacks were trapped into living in, they were very rugged and oftentimes overpopulated. Many families will have 2 or 3 generations living in a 2-bedroom apartment with only 1 bathroom on each floor. There were all places that were run down, not kept up with after whites left the area. Very dark and lonely.
What am I going to do with math? Math, yeah. What I'm going to do with math, what I'm going to go into is for the police force. That's the academy that I'm going in. You going to be a police officer? I'm going to try it. What you going to take? I'm going to be a nurse, a male nurse.
Access to equal employment opportunities has long been key to realizing the American dream. But for too long, African Americans and other minorities were shut out of much of the American workplace. They were denied jobs because of their race, segregated into less paying jobs, victims of pay discrimination and racial harassment. Many minorities face racial discrimination for many reasons. Although the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 presented the promise of equal job opportunities by eliminating job discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Employers could no longer discriminate in hiring, firing, promotions, pay, and other decisions. That didn't stop discrimination from happening. The job status of African Americans in the workplace is almost non-existent, and the opportunity for blacks to have jobs have declined significantly during the 1990s. If they happen to be employed, they are put into the lowermost job positions and earn less money than whites. But to no surprise, African American employment rates are much higher than whites because of institutional discrimination. There are numerous factors that negatively affect African Americans when trying to get a job, such as the movement of blue-collar manufacturing jobs from urban inner cities to suburbs or out of the country, the elimination of semi-skilled and unskilled occupations, the influx of immigrants willing to accept jobs traditionally filled by African American males, and a lack of males, especially young African American males. But not only do blacks face these disadvantages, whites also face these hurdles. But it is often more detrimental to blacks rather than whites. African Americans who find employment are often forced to deal with harassment and face overt discrimination in the workplace. High unemployment access across the board for blacks indicate that there's an element of racism to it, says Stephen Pitts, a labor specialist at the University of California, Berkeley. He says that the racism in other sectors, housing, education, and the criminal justice compound the difficulties African Americans face in the labor market.
Between 1940 and 1950, the percent of the black population 25 years and over with a high school diploma rose from 7.7% to 13.7%. Although this seems to be a step in the right direction, the rates for whites in the same category rose from 26.1% to 36.4%. These disparities in education and employment numbers connect the two other topics at hand: employment and housing, due to the requirements needed to attend and afford good schooling. The employment problem for the black community expresses itself in the national dropout rate for black students in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Lack of employment pulls students from schools and attributes to the lower education levels in black urban youth. After World War II, many veterans were able to lay claim to the GI Bill, which helped former soldiers fund higher education. In a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, it is stated that the availability of benefits to black veterans has a substantial and positive impact on the educational attainment of those likely to have access to colleges and universities outside the South. Unfortunately, for those more likely to be limited into the South in their collegiate choices, the GI Bill excavated rather than narrowed the economic and educational differences between black and whites. Data supporting this fact that Southerners were restricted in their choice of quality education state that less than 1% of black Southerners received a bachelor's degree due to the GI Bill, while 2% of white Southerners were able to receive a degree. This difference in data is due to the racially segregated schools of the South, which would contribute to another large issue of the 1950s. The 1950s were built on a long tradition of school segregation. The 1896 ruling on Plessy versus Ferguson stated that the racial segregation in schools was constitutional and acceptable. In a 1961 issue of the California Law Review, the writer speaks about the perceived harms done by segregation. Segregation encouraged lower quality educations for black students, poorly supplied schools and underpaid teachers, and it created a poverty gap in America. The limitations given to African Americans in the field of education helped to fuel the othering of blacks from white society and to push the African American community through the vicious cycle of unemployment, poor housing, and a lack of proper education. The Brown versus Board ruling in 1954 removed the racial restrictions on segregated schooling, but also opened up a new route of segregation: housing and income. This method of segregation is illustrated by this short film, Breaking Bread, which was made in 1954 and acknowledges the wealth differences between black and white schools.
The film you are about to see tells the story of how the schools and community in one school district are working together to build brotherhood.
The presidents of the Parents Associations of the 30 schools in our area undertook to bring together socially people of the varied racial and national backgrounds. Through understanding among the adults, we hoped to reduce prejudice and hostility.
We principals know that most schools in New York City are representative of a cross-section of its population. For the intervisitation program, however, we must plan to pair schools where housing and other factors have tended to separate people on the basis of race or nation of origin.
In every case, a school in a predominantly white neighborhood was paired with a school in a predominantly Negro area. All parents had been working together. They had attended the children's classes, gone on trips with them, taken part in discussions with children, with educators, and among themselves.
When this project started, I had serious doubts. I thought it would be dangerous, or at best, all talk. But I am grateful that my little girl has had this opportunity to work and play and talk with children who at first seemed different from herself. It has been an experience that my husband and I consider a spiritual adventure. It has brought our family closer to the grandeur of God, to learning to know the heights to which all men can rise, whatever their nationality, color, or creed, so long as they have sympathetic encouragement to achieve the best that is in them. I think our children understand what we mean when we say the oneness of the fatherhood of all.
This short film from 1954 demonstrated what can be found in other studies, that black student achievement has increased, but the minority achievement gap has persisted.